There is, or there used to be, in the college library at Magdalen, a fine copy of that well-known curiosity of literature, the Psychomachia of Matthias Grondobergensis. The subtitle is long and complex. It's full of all sorts of miscellaneous absurdities, charms, incantations, magical formulae, and so forth. The copy, as I remember it, was a fine one, on thick wrinkled paper with large margins, and in a yellow parchment binding, with the arms and coronet of some French count, I fancy, on the title. I used to prowl about in the library in those days, and take down all sorts of books. This was in a bottom shelf in the inner room, under the window, I think. When I pulled it out, a few scraps of closely written paper fell out of the book. In examining the place where they'd been lying, it seemed as if at some time or other 2 pages must have been fastened together at the top and side, because the margins were discoloured, and that the loose sheets had been pushed in at the bottom. The paste, or whatever it was, had perished. On the previous page there comes the famous incantation Quam bonus, etc., for the relief of the spirits of distressed and scrupulous scholars. The written papers seemed to be a rough diary and to have been cut out of a book. The date, I should imagine, the earlier part of the 18th century. The writing began in the middle of a sentence. I will give a few extracts before I make any comment. Spite of the ill news from home, I contrived to enjoy myself fairly with Gibbs and Lestrange. When they were gone, I drank the end of my posset, which was cold and sweet, and pulled my curtain aside before going to bed. Looking across the pond-yard, it was a fine moonlight night, I saw the figure of a man, I knew not whom, stand in a long black coat under the terrace, just where the caslamon bushes grow thickly. He seemed to hold something white in his hand, and to consider it attentively. I wondered very much at this, but believing it to be a falling shadow of a tree or what not, I thought no more of it at that time. Then follow several brief entries, such as, "Saw the man again, as fixed as ever." I do not much like this. The writer seems to have become somewhat anxious about the sight, and to have consulted one of his friends. Got Gibbs to look with me at the figure, which I saw plain enough, and asked him if he saw anything. He said, "Nothing that I can see," and looked at me so strangely that I begged him to promise to say nothing of it. I wish I had not spoken with him, for he chatters. He said he would not speak of it. The sight of the figure seems to have affected the writer's spirits, and he began to consider it in some way as a warning sent to him. A long entry of rather morbid self-examination follows. Then there comes a statement connecting the pages with the Psychomachia. Got the Psych out of the library and read much in it. God deliver me, how troubled I am. A night or two later he took a decisive step. Begged the key of the terrace from old Rigg, and though much afraid, walked to the place, and saw what amazed me strangely. The man was there, but the blackness of his clothes seemed to be dispersed as I approached. Yet I saw what he held in his hand, and it was a small white bone. Coming closer, I saw a horrid sight, which vexes me extremely to remember. A face very pale, with holes where eyes and mouth should be, hung in the air. Yet, on coming quite close, it was gone of a sudden. Then follows a curious entry. Came today on some strange writing in the Psyche, the footsteps, it seems, of one who had been before me. In one place was Feci cal mart jno Naylor, at another computavi et feci. But what displeased me most was to find a note about the bone, which is too ill to set down here. The last reference, no doubt, is to a disgusting form of incantation which may be found in a footnote on page 342 of the Psychomachia. The writer made up his mind to consult the tutor of the college. I went to Dr. Summers, and with much discomfort told him of the sight. He was kind and cheerful, and advised me against suppers and smoking, and to less reading. Then I asked him if there was ever a master of the college called Naylor, at which he turned and looked very oddly upon me for a minute, holding a book in his hand, and answered to my surprise that he would ask the master, which seemed to me no answer. He appears to have prosecuted further enquiries. Today, as I could perform no work, I talked with old Rigg about Mr. Naylor. He was not a fellow, but a member who lived in the college and was much given to study. He died by the terrace, having fallen in a fit. There was much ado to prevent an inquest, yet it was prevented. Then follows, "The master sent for me and advised me not to study so late. He said no more, but seemed vexed." The end of the story is not complete. The writer seems to have got entirely unhinged by his experience, and to have become able to discern the figure even on dark nights. The bones seemed to burn with a lowish light and to send out sparks. He finally consulted a parson, unnamed, who lived in the town, perhaps the incumbent of St. Giles, told the parson all the story, and he said he could deliver me. We went together to the Copt Hall field, and so through the gate to the terrace, where he left me, bidding me fall to prayer. Then he went forwards, and I heard him speak in a loud voice, when I was suddenly delivered from my fear. God be praised! He came back pale and trembling, and I noticed that he sweated much. Later he had me to the parsonage, where I spoke freely to him, and purposed to amend. He told me that it was a sore business, and that this kind went not out but by— The manuscript ends at this point. It is hopeless to conjecture with any certainty what the facts are. There is the recorded burial of a Mr. Naylor in the St. Giles Register, of Magdalen College, M.A. But whether the writer of this diary, who was evidently an undergraduate, had been prosecuting studies into occult matters before the apparition occurred, what the ill news were, whether the sight was a mere figment of his imagination, or whether it was a species of psychical obsession, it is impossible to say. I confess that the brevity and simplicity of the entries gives the story a strong sense of verisimilitude, and it is perhaps just as well that it's impossible to investigate the matter further. I remember that I myself, after finishing the pages, was seized with a sort of horror at the whole business. I did just turn a few further leaves of the Psychomachia, and saw a few more of Mr. Naylor's neat annotations, though it seemed to me that as the book went on a kind of agitation crept into the notes, both in their substance and in their calligraphy. Beyond that I could not go, and what has become of the old volume I do not care to enquire. I replaced it in its dusty corner beneath the window, shutting the manuscript in among the pages. I should like to have destroyed the record and the book as well, and I hope with all my heart that someone at once more sensible and independent than myself may have lighted on it all and committed book and diary alike to the cleansing fire.